So as you are all aware, today's motion is: women in Japan and South Korea need quotas to advance. It is a known fact that Japan and South Korea, Northeast Asia's strongest economies and well-respected democracies, struggle with gender equality. In a World Economic Forum survey from 2021, they ranked 120th for Japan and 102nd for South Korea on gender equality out of 156 countries surveyed. And just for comparison, Switzerland, the country where I'm coming to you from, ranks 10th on that same survey. Large majorities of the governments of these countries consist of men, and not just that, men mostly in their 60s or 70s or even 80s, and hence do not represent all of society. In the workforce also, gender representation is nowhere near equal, especially in leadership positions. Interestingly, labor force participation of women in these countries follows like an M shape, with a significant drop between the ages of 30 and 40, making it all but impossible for women to climb the career ladder in a self-declared meritocratic corporate culture. Adding to that is also sometimes openly displayed misogyny, be it in Japan by top representatives such as the former head of the Tokyo Olympics Organizing Committee, Yoshiro Mori, who had to step down last year after sexist comments, or shortly after, the reigning LDP, who invited women to participate in the all-male board meetings under the condition that they do not speak. Or, of course, in South Korea, where more and more young men move their anti-feminist rallies from online to the streets. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our two teams arguing in favor and against the motion. Arguing for the motion is Satona Suzuki, a lecturer in advanced Japanese and modern Japanese history at SOAS University of London. Her main interests are Japanese modernity, imperialism, militarism, and politics and religion. Joining her arguing for the motion is Se-Woong Koo, founder of Korea Exposé, an independent media outlet that now operates as a subscription-based newsletter about all things Korean. He has contributed regularly to the New York Times opinion section, Al Jazeera, and the BBC World Service. And here we are. Hey, Se-Woong. He's also our first returning debater in an Oxford debate. Welcome back. Though we did just discuss before that last time the team that he was on lost, so he gets to try again today. Arguing the other side against the motion is Pallavi Aiyar, an award-winning journalist who has worked as a foreign correspondent for over 2 decades, reporting from China, Europe, Indonesia, and Japan. She's an associate editor of The Globalist and writes a weekly Substack newsletter on global culture called The Global Jigsaw. Her latest book is Orienting an Indian in Japan. And finally, joining Pallavi on the side arguing against the motion is Young-Im Lee, assistant professor of political science at California State University in Sacramento, where she also currently is, and where she teaches gender politics and East Asian politics. Her research primarily focuses on the effectiveness of gender quotas in elections. Thank you all for being with us here today. It's a pleasure to have you on. And without further ado, let's just jump right into opening statements. And I will hand over to Satona Suzuki for her remarks arguing in favor of today's motion. Satona, you have 4 minutes on the clock and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Serena, Nico, and Asia Society. I'm going to cut to the chase since I only have 4 minutes. So it's no brainer that women in Japan and South Korea need quotas to advance. My reason for supporting this motion is very simple. Despite the fact that gender equality is guaranteed in the respective constitution, both countries suffer from gender inequality and discrimination today. We need quotas to change the current situation for women in both countries. Japan is a G7 member with the 3rd largest economy in the world, yet female representation is an utter disaster. As Nico just explained, its gender gap index is ranked 120th out of 156 countries, and female political participation is equally embarrassing at 165th out of 189 countries. Considering that half of the population is female, it just doesn't make sense that the vast majority of lawmakers are men. In Japan, aging male politicians dominate the political sphere. Only 10% of lawmakers are women in the lower house and 23% in the upper house. That means that men decide women's future, and that's just not right, in my opinion. And actually, it goes beyond female issues because gender issues include everyone. We need women's voice for Japan's and South Korea's future now that the world is moving towards a more diverse, inclusive, and more sort of socially, economically, and even spiritually sustainable society. Sure, gender quotas are controversial and may not be perfect. For example, it's been criticized that it goes against the principle of equal opportunity, like allowing unqualified women to gain positions and depriving men of opportunities and so forth. But according to the research conducted by London School of Economics, based on quotas in Sweden, this is not true. As you know, in Sweden, 57.1% of women occupy ministerial positions and 47 in parliaments. So that's incredible. The research proves that quotas exclude mediocre men who are not able or qualified, and instead it increases the opportunities for more capable men and women. So it's a win-win situation for everyone. So okay, the situation is different in Japan because of deeply ingrained patriarchy. You know, there are unconscious gender biases and gender role traditions of male breadwinners and female homemakers. And even today, 70% of women in the 20s and 30s want their partners or husbands to be breadwinners. And also in 2018, prominent medical schools rigged entrance exam scores to favor male students because female doctors tend to quit after having families anyway. So, and this also extends to the imperial family. You know, the imperial household allows only sons to become emperor, and when a female member wants to marry a commoner, she has to give up her titles, just as former Princess Mako did. So gender inequality is no longer sustainable, and Japan needs to address it urgently, or it can't claim its place as a world leading democratic power, excuse me. We all deserve to live an authentic life, regardless of gender. The only way to combat patriarchy and eliminate gender inequality is through quotas. Sure, there are obstacles. Sure, it may take a long time for it to function, but that doesn't mean that we should give up on the idea altogether. We just have to apply it carefully and meaningfully, just as Sweden and New Zealand did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Satona, for that fantastic opening statements, wonderfully also within your time. Let me just hand it right back on to the person delivering opening statements arguing against the motion. That's Young-Im Lee, joining us from Sacramento. Young-Im, you also have 4 minutes and the floor is yours.
So in my statement, I'll mainly focus on South Korea's electoral gender quotas and my fellow panelist Pallavi on Japan. So here's the setup. There are 2 different types of legislators in South Korea, South Korea National Assembly, and also 2 different types of gender quotas currently in place. So more than 80% of the total 300 members, they're elected at the district level. And political parties are recommended, and recommended is an emphasis here, to nominate 30% of their candidates with women. Less than 20% of the total seats, total members, are elected through the nationwide elections, which is considered to be less prestigious than the district level seats. And parties are recommended to slate half of their candidates with women. This sounds all great, right? 50% and 30%. However, the impact of gender quotas has been limited, mainly due to the quota system design and the lack of sanctions for parties' non-compliance. I'll focus on 3 main points here. Number 1, the outcome. The current gender quotas recommend rather than require women to be included on candidate list. Therefore, the current system offers no guarantee that women will be actually elected. The most recent election in April 2020, women won 19% of the total seats, the highest ever in its history. Still, 19% is below the Asian average of 21%. And as of January 2022, South Korea ranks 124th globally regarding the share of women in the National Assembly more than 2 decades after the quota adoption. Number 2, compliance. The current form of quotas rely on political parties' good faith effort and does not impose sanctions for non-compliance. So some political parties just simply ignore the law because there are no consequences. For the district level representatives, again, which is more prestigious, major political parties have never met the 30% target, not even close. parties tend to comply with the 50% quotas for the nationwide seats, but as they are less than 20% of the total seats, the numerical outcome of the quota has been really limited. Lastly, limited lasting effect. The 50% national-wide seats is a great way for political newcomers, including women, to start their first term, but they do not help much for re-election. So nationwide members, they have a hard time getting nominated for the next election. And even if they are, their re-election rate is pretty low. For various reasons I'll be happy to explain after. Therefore, many nationwide members, they become one-term members, even when they want to continue their legislative career and when they can completely use their 4 years of experience in the following term. So here's my conclusion. I'm not suggesting quotas are unnecessary or useless. However, to advance part of the motion, I am against. Quotas in South Korea has shown very limited impact, and a lot needs to happen together to advance and empower women, including changing political parties' discriminatory behaviors and gendered expectations of women in society and in politics, beyond just adopting gender quotas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Young-Im. Also perfectly on time. What a wonderful opening statement arguing against the motion. With that, let's move on to rebuttals. And I'm calling on Se-Woong Koo to deliver the rebuttal for the team arguing in favor of the motion. You have 4 minutes as well on the clock, please.
As Young-Im just rightly pointed out, 19% of lawmakers in the Korean National Assembly are female. Women also make up less than 10% of senior researchers at state-funded think tanks, and a mere 20% of employees at country's 30 biggest firms are women. And the earnings gap between Korean men and women is around 30%. That's double the OECD average. This reality is really hard to ignore. Inequality in Korea is real, and measures must be taken at the top. Quotas, when they're designed well, can be one clear solution. I think it's interesting to point out that some people oppose quotas on the basis that it actually devalues women because it gives impression that women need extra support to move up. But interestingly, data shows that women are very much worthy. Not just in Korea, but around the world, girls outperform boys routinely. And more than 20 years long, a larger share of Korean girls have advanced to university education than boys have. In 2021, last year, that difference was almost 5%. Data also indicates that Korean women do much better on standardized tests. Some 2/3 of those passing the national exam to select diplomats are women. Women now make up some 30% of the legal profession. And even on tests to select civil servants, top scores in Korea are routinely women. None of this is a secret in Korea, but despite this, women are not always easy to see in top positions. It's because Korean men argue that women do not deserve professional success because women tend to work less than men. And it's true that Korean women put in fewer hours into paid work because they're expected to do so much more at home. Korean men do the least amount of household chores and childcare in the OECD. And among married couples, less than half that have double incomes, meaning that women work too. This is again presented as evidence that women are happy to be full-time homemakers. But this is not what many young Korean women say. They want to have thriving careers, but they cannot, not without giving up on marriage and motherhood. This explains why more and more Korean women say they don't see the need to get married, and the marriage rate falls continuously in Korea. But even though women are getting shortchanged in the workplace because of the assumption that they will not be committed to their jobs or leave in order to start a family, somehow the women are simply not given a chance to move up in Korea, and this is really the fundamental problem. There are many ways of keeping women down in Korea, and they can be quite insidious. Just like in Japan, scandals have shown that scores can be manipulated in favor of men. And even in cases where equal proportions of men and women are hired, a closer look at data reveals that a larger proportion of men tend to pass the final interview. This indicates a clear bias on the part of HR teams and senior management. We need to acknowledge that quotas aren't only for women. Korea actually already has a quota when it comes to exams for selecting public servants. And interestingly here, men benefit more than women because their performance tends to be worse than the performance of women. And I need to point out that the Korean private sector is now also looking at quotas, publicly traded funded with assets worth more than 1.6 billion US dollars. They need to now have each one female board member, and this has significantly helped to increase the number in higher positions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Se-Woong, for this rebuttal arguing in favor of the motion. And let's just pass it right along to our last speaker for this opening round, Pallavi Aiyar, arguing against the motion with her rebuttal. Please.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I think what's become clear over the last several minutes is that almost all of us panelists agree on the fundamentals, that there is a problem and that possibly quotas in themselves are not a bad thing. But I think where we're going to differ is on how we believe the best way is to address what these fundamental problems are. As was discussed at the beginning, I'll be focusing on Japan, and let me get right to it. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that women in Japan actually exceed the rate of labor force participation of women in most countries around the world, even the United States. If you look at the prime age female labor force participation rate, Japan's is over 75%, and the US is about 74.3%. So the problem of women in Japan is not that they do not work, but it's the kind of work they do. Because the fact is that far more Japanese women work in part-time and non-regular jobs than men, and they also occupy a much smaller share of executive positions compared with other developed countries. And as has been discussed, there's also an egregious absence of women in politics. Now, that the patriarchy has deep roots in Japan is indisputable. And no one is arguing that gender inequality does not exist in Japan. But the thing is that Japan is not alone in being patriarchal. But there is one obstacle for women in Japan that is particularly acute in Japan, which is not necessarily the case in Sweden or New Zealand or some of the other examples that Suzuki-san pointed out. And it is one that quotas will do nothing to redress. And this is a general habit of overwork that penalizes flexibility and rewards time spent at the workplace, so that you have an almost sacred reverence for hard work built into the company culture in Japan. So for employees, stoic endurance is considered a virtue, while leaving the office before one's superiors is massively frowned upon, so that it borders on the impossible to balance the demands of raising children with work norms that are common in Japan. Rather than just a lack of women in the workforce, I would argue that the larger problem in Japan is a punishing work culture that makes any semblance of work-life balance impossible. A culture of overwork keeps women out of the economy, and I think that quotas would do nothing to address this fundamental problem. At best, what quotas might do is set up a false dichotomy, an illusion of choice that you can choose to be a business executive or a politician. No one is preventing you, a woman, from doing it. In fact, look, we've even made it easier for you with quotas. But this is a false choice because it merely reserves some of the available work options for women rather than highlighting the fundamental problem with those options and the need to expand those options. Equal pay, paternity leave, workplace flexibility, these are the things that will truly help women, and they will not be addressed by quotas. The biggest problem that women face is the assumption that they will quit their jobs once they have babies. And frankly, that is true because of this fundamental lack of choice that I'm talking about. It is also true that the lack of female role models in leadership positions may be one reason young women in Japan often quit working after their first child. The fact is that I would argue that the lack of daycare centers or the social stigma against hiring professional help is a much bigger obstacle. Quotas do nothing for this problem. No parent can be expected to bring up a child satisfactorily if their work environment is willfully blind to their other responsibilities, parenthood or elderly care. So ultimately, rather than quotas, what would really help women and men is a systemic overhaul of Japan's work practices.
I'm going to have to cut you off there, Pallavi. I'm sorry, really sorry. I have to cut you off because your time has run up. But I think that was an excellent final point there. We said like a systemic overhaul of the system, of course, would help much. And I think that's a great starting point for our conversation. So normally in these Oxford debates, we're not going to go super deep into the issue at hand, trying to explain it. We're trying to lay out arguments. But here I do feel that at least briefly, while it's clear that everybody here agrees that there is an issue in both of these countries with gender equality, I do want to very briefly talk about the why. That is a multifaceted question, but still, it sometimes puzzles me, and I would like to ask Satona and Young Im to briefly comment on Japan and South Korea respectively on this. These are incredibly successful countries. They're economically powerful. They've made huge gains over the last decades. And we kind of have this idea, I think, that sort of economic development and greater gender equality sort of go hand in hand. For the case of Japan, what would be the key 2-3 reasons that you see that Japan actually is still dealing with this issue in such a fundamental way?
Yes. So did you say 3 main
Yes.
issues? 3. Okay. I can come up with traditional gender roles, definitely. Still sort of ingrained patriarchal ideology. So that's one. And I can't really think of anything else. I mean, all the issues stem from that, really.
But then let me quickly follow up. So these traditions, of course, they're not limited to Japan or limited to South Korea. Those beliefs exist in other places, and they used to be quite pervasive in many countries around the world. Mm-hmm. Why is it that in Japan and in South Korea, these beliefs seem to not have changed at equal pace with the economic development of the country?
Well, I'm not really convinced that like other countries who, which are like making on the top of the list in terms of political, social, economic representation of women, whether they have really like gender equal mentality or culture. It's mainly institutions. So when you look at the list of countries, the rankings of countries, I'm focusing on politics because that's my thing. Top 5 or top 10 countries, there are big surprises to many of the students. Like Rwanda is number 1. Like United Arab Emirates is like number 3 or number 4 as of January 2022. So even the culture, of course, patriarchy is a big factor. But that's the case in everywhere. I think the problem is institutional and systemic, issue. Like as Pallavi said, yeah, if you are compensating for like overwork, then women will really have a hard time, they're continuing their career and being a representative. And also political parties, that's the big thing. It's not women, it's not voters. Political parties, they are distorting the system. They are not nominating women. When they nominate women, they send them to unwinnable districts, right? So I think it's not so much about the culture of the general population, but the gatekeepers, those who have power in politics, economy, or what have you, and also the system and the institutions.
Thank you very much. Now, of course, today's conversation is more focused on the question of quotas and maybe perhaps even more focused on the question of whether quotas are necessary or a sufficient way to help advance women in Japan and South Korea. Now, Se-Woong, I want to ask you, you've argued forcefully in favor of quotas, but it seemed to me that Pallavi in her rebuttal made a really good argument and said there's just this danger because it's such a deeply ingrained cultural issue that we kind of run the risk of saying we have quotas, so all is fine, right? So if we put out the quotas, they may not even do anything because it's an incredibly difficult problem to change. How would you respond to that? How can we be sure that quotas are not just a good idea, but will actually affect change in a meaningful, meaning also somewhat fast way, right? So we'd ideally like to resolve this issue not in the next 150 years, but maybe in the next 10 or so. Why are you so convinced that quotas are a good way to achieve that? It seems the evidence at the very, very least is mixed, right? Sometimes they work maybe a little bit, sometimes they don't work at all. So why is it that you are so convinced that quotas can be sort of the panacea for the one silver bullet for this problem?
Yeah, I certainly don't say that quotas are panacea, but I certainly do believe they can work because they are working. It is in effect in Korea, as I pointed out in my opening statement, and it is actually benefiting men in a great way when it comes to being selected for public servant positions. And the law that I was touching on at the very end, which mandates, not recommends, but mandates that the big Korean companies must have at least one female member on the board. This is something that you cannot question, and it is having an impact. It's gone into effect, just at the end of last year, and we have seen a huge jump in the number of women who are on the board. Although you can say that in the large scheme of things, this is not a lot. It is a difference from what we had before. I think it's good to point out that Young Im said quotas do not work when they are designed poorly. But we can have well-designed quotas, no question. And this is something that will benefit not just women, but also men in the future, because we're seeing a reality in Korea where men are clearly doing more poorly than women. And I'm sure they will also be on board when they start to realize that this is something that can benefit them, not just the other side. Pallavi's comment on overwork is important because this is an issue that Korea also suffers from as well. But what is interesting to point out in the Korean context is that many young Korean women say quite publicly that they're willing to forego being a mother, having a family, so that they can have meaningful career. So given that circumstance, I don't think it is unreasonable to allow them to have a chance at moving up through a hierarchy that is still very much dominated by the patriarchy. Thank you.
And I would like to continue the conversation with Pallavi. You argued against quotas, and I think so the gist of your argument was they're the right tool, but for the wrong problem. And I wanted to push back on that a little bit. And again, I think we can all agree that it's a multifaceted and complex problem. But it seems to me the one argument I really like in favor of quotas is that they're kind of like a wedge that you can drive in, right? So they're maybe not something that all by themselves will solve the issues, but they will get the ball rolling, right? And there's once you have higher female participation in leadership roles, once you have more women in politics, that will then be sort of almost a necessary precondition to affect the systemic change that you've called for. So the quotas themselves are not going to solve everything, but they can provide maybe sort of the starting point, the first domino, if you want, that will then sort of have all these secondary effects that will actually get us forward, because it's really, really hard to change the system directly. So why would you not agree that quotas are sort of a good way?
I agree that they might have domino effects, but I think that the domino effects would possibly run in the other direction, and they could lead to backfire, discrimination. They could lead to men feeling increasingly insecure and sort of doubling down rather than developing a more open attitude towards having women in the workplace. It could lead towards prejudice against women for not actually being qualified, but just being there because of quotas, despite the fact that, as has been proven, they are achieving as much, if not more than men when it comes to their educational qualifications. So if you are looking at domino effects, you can also have negative domino effects. And what I'm arguing is that when you have something like quotas in a country like Japan, it's like putting a bandage on a broken arm. It's not going to solve anything seriously. It might have some kind of a placebo effect, but what you're probably going to end up having is women who enter the workforce or through these quotas having to ultimately behave like men in order to continue to be successful. So that is not ultimately an empowering thing for women. What is really going to be empowering is a change in socialization, a change in social norms, which quotas will not necessarily do anything for. We need to be able to nurture an entire generation of confident women and confident men, and we need to be able to give them real choices. I do not believe that if you say, okay, I mean, frankly, people will have to choose between a career and having any kind of life, they should still be given the choice of having a career as the right way forward. You're never going to get a critical mass of gender empowerment in that sense. You might get some women who are willing to make that choice, but for men and women and society in general to be empowered and to progress, you need a fundamental overhaul of the work practices in countries like this. And I think that unless they start working smarter and more flexibly, there's going to be knock-on effects that will be bad for women, that will be bad for men, that will be bad for families. Quotas are not the way to solve this problem.
Thank you. And I think you're making a really interesting point here with sort of the reverse domino effect, kind of the negative domino effect. And let me ask Young Im, because I very briefly mentioned this at the beginning, we are seeing kind of an effect that is maybe like this in South Korea, where there is sort of a much more pronounced anti-feminist movement that is mostly fueled by young men. Don't want to get into the complexities of South Korean domestic politics, but there is a presidential election coming up where that is not a huge factor, but it is a factor. Is that an effect that we're seeing from your point of view? So is this anti-feminist movement in South Korea a backlash against quotas, or more broadly against policies that are designed to help advance the cause of women?
Absolutely, because the adoption of gender quotas has been, even though there was a very strong activism from women's and feminist movement, it's for a lot of people in South Korean citizens, it is a top-down, like imposed upon kind of system to change the structure. So there's not so much buy-in from the general population that this is something we need to do as a country. Right. So as you said, there's a very strong anti-gender movement, which made to the New York Times, January 1st of this year, strong anti-gender movement in South Korea. What are some of their rallying cries? First of all, abolishing the Ministry of Gender Equality, and the second, abolishing gender, quotas. Whether their argument is, valid or not, as you can see, gender quotas can be used as a very easy target for those who are rallying against feminism. That this is, now, there's a reverse sexism, there's a reverse, discrimination against men. So it's going to provide very easy target for those who are not really in favor of gender equality. And I actually want to add to the Pallavi's point about the role model effect. I think it's really also important to ask, what kind of women are going to be benefited from such gender quotas? Is it going to be women of lower, economic and other status? Or as Se-Woong said, there is this new mandate law that some of the board members of big companies should be women. So we are mainly talking about like elite, middle class, upper middle class women. So also we need to think about what kind of women will be benefited from the gender quotas. Is there going to be a trickle effect? I haven't seen that. I don't think we haven't seen any evidence supporting that aspect.
Thank you. We're already slowly coming towards the end of the Q&A, so I do want to give room to some of the audience questions. So Satna, let me ask you this. We have an audience question here that I really like, arguing that of course Japan, and I think the same we could say to a certain extent also South Korea, but maybe more pronounced in Japan, it's already a country that faces severe shortages in the labor market. So this is not just a cultural thing, it's just not about changing attitudes. It actually very, very clearly would make a lot of economic sense. And couldn't we argue that eventually, at a point in the possibly not too distant future, the economic pressure will just become so big that these changes will take effect anyway, right? So that all the quotas, all the policies we could come up with and design will sort of pale in comparison to just the sheer pressure of having to keep up an economy, and that's just at a certain point not going to be possible without more deeply integrating women in both economic and political life of the country. Are we seeing this effect already? Is the problem maybe just going to basically go away on its own?
I don't think it's going to go away on its own. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. Yes, it's not going to go on its own. But like Pallavi said earlier, you know, female labor force participation rate is now higher than ever before right now, and it's higher than the United States. But the problem is 54.5% hold irregular employment. So that sort of creates a gapping instability, you know, pay gap and instability compared to their male counterparts. And of course, it's not going to be sustainable. And it has to be, like Yong said, it has to be changed institutionally or politically. So it has to, I think quota actually works if it's sort of takes the form of legislative quotas rather than voluntary quotas.
Thank you very much. One other question from the audience that I really liked, Se-Woong, let me put this to you, is, and I think that probably goes for, again for both Japan and South Korea, as well as for any other place on the planet, is that the last 2 years of the pandemic have also, as a side effect, probably brought with them some changes to, you know, like work culture. Obviously, working from home has become much more dominant. That may have brought with it some flexibility. How do you assess the situation specifically in South Korea? Did we see these changes? Did we see them in a big way? And would you expect them to change even once the pandemic is over? And could that maybe, you know, sort of have an effect, or at least help us speed up the process towards a greater gender equality?
Well, we have certainly seen a huge change, and it has not been very good. We have seen an increase in the rate of suicide among young people, especially young women. And we have seen a large number of people working in the service industry losing their jobs. And that happens to be a lot of young women. So what the pandemic has shown in the context of Korea is that a lot of young women, despite having education and despite having jobs, are extremely vulnerable to this kind of social change, and that they deserve more protection. But this is certainly not what's been seen in Korea, because Korea still considers the idea of the male breadwinner to be so central to its workings of society that whenever we hear about the measures to give support to the public, we are focusing on that same old model of the traditional family, the father, the husband. And there is very little debate about what can be done for the people who are actually impacted the most. So if you're going to ask me if I see positive change on the horizon, I'm afraid I'm going to have to sound quite pessimistic here. And I think this is once again evidence that there needs to be change at a structural level. And we talk about culture, we talk about the mindset, but you cannot change the culture and mindset without sending a very definitive message to the public. And that can only be done through mandates and laws. And quotas certainly can be a part of that.
Thank you. Let me actually pick up what you said at the very end, because it also plays towards an audience questions I wanted to ask Pallavi, which was that if you're arguing for change of culture and for change of systems, but you're arguing against quotas, what would be your way to change the system? So if you had, if you had an all-powerful policy wand and you could come up with any policy you wanted, it obviously wouldn't be quotas, but what would it be? Like, what do you think would be the most effective way to bring about systemic change on this issue?
To be honest, I think if you came up with paternity leave, mandatory paternity leave, you would see a huge change. I mean, everything in Japan, at least, it's about women are going to stop working after they have kids because they have to look after the children. And that's why we don't want to hire them beyond a certain level. If you made it to really level the playing field, rather than give quotas for women, if you made it mandatory for men to take a certain career break once they had children, I think that would equalize the field much quicker and much more effectively.
Thank you very much. We only have like maybe 2 minutes left. There's one question which is a little bit out of left field, but 2 people have asked it, so I did want to throw it out there. And that's the question of comparing Japan and South Korea on this issue with Taiwan. We did before say that we're not going to talk about China, but Taiwan may be sort of a slightly more manageable size and easier to compare, though obviously much smaller than either Japan or South Korea. Would any of you want to offer an opinion on Taiwan, where obviously the situation is very different. Young Im, I see you nodding. Did Taiwan get where it is with quotas?
Yeah, but Taiwan's quotas, we can trace this back to the 1950s. Like Taiwan has a really long history of having, I'm also mainly talking about electoral quotas in the country. Yes. And then the Taiwan is actually a really good example that what quotas can do potentially. I am undermining my own side right now. So as you know, the percentage of women in politics is more than 40%. Unlike South Korea, a lot of Taiwanese female politicians, those who are elected at the local level, they can actually move on to the national level, which is lacking. That kind of spillable effect to the national level is completely lacking in South Korea. But the thing is, for Taiwan, actually emphasizing my previous point, they have sanctions for non-compliance. If political parties do not follow through, the National Election Commission rejects their candidate list. So it has a higher threshold, and also it has a mechanism for sanctions for non-compliance. That's what makes Taiwan's case kind of successful case. Yeah. So again, going back to the design issue.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That brings us already to the end of the Q&A and discussion. We're going to be moving into closing statements. The order for the closing statements is the same as for the opening statements. So again, I would ask Satona Suzuki first to deliver her closing arguments arguing in favor of the motion, which is that women in Japan and South Korea need quotas to advance. Satona, you have 2 minutes on the clock.
Thank you. So now that I listen to everyone, I'm more convinced that Japan and South Korea need quotas to advance. And I understand their concerns and problems, but to deal with the reality of women in Japan and South Korea, to adopt quotas in an institutional and systematic level is necessary. Because there's a big gap between theory and practice. In theory, the law guarantees gender equality, but in practice, real equal opportunities do not exist for many reasons. The reality is that women are disadvantaged from day one. So men have been given preference over women for ages, even though women are as qualified and as worthy as men. So that's precisely why in Japan and South Korea, the only way to realize real equal opportunities is through quotas. Yes, obstacles exist, but once adopted, I don't see why quotas wouldn't work in Japan and South Korea if adopted carefully and meaningfully, just taking the context into consideration. In Japan, I think legislative quotas are necessary rather than voluntary ones to just change the entire narrative. It's certainly better than leaving it as is. I realize it is a bit of a catch-22 situation, but it's worth a try, right? And I believe we have an obligation to inspire and encourage the next generation. And Japan needs more female representation with a clear agenda for gender equality in politics and business to change the whole narrative socially, politically, and institutionally. I repeat my point that gender equality is for all genders and society as a whole. And we should aim for a more equal and healthier society where every single one of us thrives. And we can start that by adopting gender quotas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move it right along for the closing statements from Young Im Lee arguing against the motion. Young Im, you also have 2 minutes.
Despite great promise and potential to advance women's representation, the current gender quotas for national elections in South Korea only had limited effect. Even though women legislators are as politically experienced, as well-educated, and as actively involved in legislative activities as their male counterparts, the share of women in National Assembly is still very, very low. After 2 decades of gender quotas, we are talking about what actually happened here. So women in South Korea have to overcome a lot of barriers in every stage of their political participation, starting from the candidate emergence stage, like thinking about running for office, and the candidate nomination stage, election stage, and legislative activities once they are elected. So as Pallavi mentioned, the culture of overwork and lack of work-life balance cannot be addressed by gender quotas, and also all the different stages of political participation. So quotas alone are not enough to address various cultural, social, economic, and political causes of women's underrepresentation. So I'll end my remark by making a plea to change our perspective and framing. instead of problematizing women's underrepresentation as if it's women's problem to fix, we should really ask instead how men's overrepresentation limits representative democracy and also opportunities for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Young Emma. You're calling for almost negative quotas for men there. That is a good way to end your argument. Let me just move it right along to Se-Woong arguing with his closing statements in favor of the motion as well. And of course, you also have 2 minutes.
I think everybody here is in agreement that there's something fundamentally wrong with the culture and social norms in Korea and Japan, and that's why so many women suffer. But I do not agree that quotas would function, in the words of Pallavi, like a bandage on a wound. If it's only a bandage, it certainly would not arouse this much emotion. They are controversial precisely because they're powerful and they can be effective. And the fact that they are controversial does not mean that we should not consider them as a real option. Korea has been trying for years to pass an anti-discrimination act, but it hasn't worked because it's controversial too. Many things are controversial, but at the same time, the right thing to do. I agree. There are other issues we need to consider, like overwork in Korea and in Japan. And we need to see that many people who suffer from overwork are men, perhaps because they take on too much. If women can be given a role to take on some of the responsibilities, then we would actually solve the problem, because then the work will be shared equally. Finally, I would like to touch on the issue that women today in Korea indeed suffer from lack of role models in higher positions. How do we solve that? By ensuring that talented women can move on to the top of society. And we can achieve that in the beginning, as a wedge, introduce the quota system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And of course, that leaves us with our last closing statement. Pallavi, you have the last word for today, and you have 2 minutes.
So, as I've been saying, I think beyond quotas, what women really need to succeed in the workforce is social and a public support that will allow them to realize their multiple roles in society as employees, as mothers, as daughters, as carers, which the quota system does nothing to address. In fact, I think a quota system can create a kind of screen. It can create a lot of smoke. I mean, there are a lot of emotions that are evoked by that, but I reiterate that it is like a bandage on a broken arm, because if you end up having quotas, it's quite easy to say, oh, look, now we have a certain number of reserved seats for women, the problems are solved. When in fact, what we really need are a host of other policy measures like mandatory paternity leave, like high quality daycare centers, like flexible working hours, none of which will necessarily be addressed by just having quotas for women. I think that rather than quotas, what people could have are like targets, because it has been shown that just having a clear awareness of female hiring targets is likely to increase the incidence of giving preference to women if there are male and female candidates with equal qualifications. So rather than mandating it and making this kind of backfire discrimination a reality and making it feel as though women are just getting it because of a mandate rather than deserving it, it can create the awareness that diversity is something that is useful and needed. I'll end it over there.
Thank you very much. You've all been very brief, very to the point, very powerful in your closing statements. And so that leaves us with well enough time to end this conversation. Thank you all very, very much for your arguments so far. Of course, now it's the audience turn to vote. And I'm now being told that we have the result, which is very exciting. So let's see them on screen. I haven't seen them yet, so I also need a minute to look at them and see where we are. So in the first poll, 59% of you agreed with the motion, 15 disagreed, and 26 said that they didn't know. In the second poll, 73% agreed with the motion, 23 disagreed to the motion, only 4% did not know, which means that both teams actually convinced people. So we have a huge decline in people who don't know. People really have made up their minds, but of course the team arguing in favor of the motion, Satona Suzuki, Se-Woong Koo, you have won with 14% advance versus 8%. But of course, a wonderful performance from both teams. So again, thank you very, very much for joining us.